Welcome to the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum's Zoom series, Trolleyology. My name is Kristen Fredrickson. I'm the Manager of Public Programs and Outreach here at the museum. Thank you very, very much for joining us today. We should have a great turnout, over 100 people registered. Welcome back to those of you who have joined us many times before. This virtual series features programs on Pennsylvania transit history topics and stories about the trolley era and our collection that you can experience from home, usually on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. And we're going to continue these programs as long as we have presenters. So if you have a show that you would like to share, or if you know somebody with a program that fits our museum mission, please let me know. That would be anything about Pennsylvania, the trolley era, cities where our streetcars come from. If you have a program that doesn't quite fit those guidelines, please feel free to reach out as well. And we have a full list of upcoming presentations on our website at patrolley.org, which I will share in the chat in just a couple minutes. And I want to extend a very special thank you to those of you who donated during tonight's registration process and those who have donated on our website throughout the year. We really, really appreciate your support of our virtual outreach programs. So really quickly, just to introduce the museum to our new folks tonight, we were established in 1954 as the Arden Electric Railway by a group of trolley enthusiasts called the Pittsburgh Electric Railway Club. And we opened to visitors just a few years later in 1963. And we're actually located along the route of the former interurban line between Pittsburgh and Washington, PA. You'll find around 50 trolleys and electric railway cars here, about 20 of which operate, soon to be more, and around 30,000 visitors per year take the 4-mile scenic ride at the museum. So just a couple updates for everybody. We do have some new sidewalks going in at our new Welcome and Education Center, which is on track to open later this year. We're very excited. So on the left, you can see another safety or another bullnose and the Volunteer Boulevard brick paved street and some of the canopy there on the Volunteer Boulevard side of the building. And on the right, that's the front of the building there. So these are actually from, I think, last week or the week before. So we've got even more done now. It's always very exciting. It's constantly changing right now. So if you haven't had a chance to come out recently, please do that, or definitely join us later this year. Stay tuned to our social media for when the new building will be opening. And another very exciting thing, which you may be able to see in my virtual background here, the terrible trolley has arrived at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum. Car number 1713 was stored in Ohio from about 1998 until May 31st. And our friends at Brownlee Trucking brought it to the museum, and a whole team of volunteers is restoring that right now. In fact, when I left the museum today, they were working on it almost every day. The project is currently led by a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old, and we're very excited to share updates about this on our social media. You can also go to our website. You'll see a blog, which we're going to keep updated about progress on the terrible trolley restoration. So it will be repainted in those Steeler colors. We're working with the Steelers and the terrible towel, and we're going to have all that stuff hopefully very soon. So stay tuned. Okay. So now I would like to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Mary Jane Kuffner Hirt. Mary Jane Kuffner Hirt, Professor Emerita, Indiana University of Pennsylvania, taught graduate and undergraduate political science and public administration courses for 28 years. She also has worked as a city manager, Forest Hills Borough and O'Hara Township, and local government administrator. Dr. Hirt has a BA in Government and Public Service from IUP and master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Over the last 17 years as a family historian, her research and writing has focused primarily on her colonial-era Scots-Irish ancestors' migration to America and investigating the Mount Washington Tunnel accident. Dr. Hirt currently works as a local government consultant and lives in Harmer Township in Allegheny County. And just as a reminder, at the end of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session with the presenter, but the chat box will be open throughout the program. So feel free to enter questions and comments during the show, and we'll get to those at the end. And just to note, this program is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you, Mary Jane, for letting us do that. So please keep your microphones muted. We'll turn off our videos now, and I will invite you to turn those back on at the end. All right, Dr. Hirt, take it away.
Thank you. Uh-oh. There we go. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your day to listen to the story of my research. I appreciate the Trolley Museum giving me the opportunity to speak. I think this story is an important one when you think about Western Pennsylvania trolley transportation and the history that we've had in Western Pennsylvania. Tonight, I'd like to do three different things. Tell the story, of course, and essentially that story has not been put together into one package since the beginning of the 1900s. So I was interested in pulling all the threads together to create the picture of this tragedy so that it could be part of our public history today. Secondly, I'd like to explain a little bit about the research that I did and where I was able to gather the material that went into the book. And then lastly, my response to this story has been really interesting. People read about it in the newspaper, have read the book, and passed it along to other family members, and then got in contact with me about their connection to the story. So at the end of the presentation, I have a few slides that indicate a little bit of that part of the picture. People always ask me, why did you do this? Why did you spend 10, 11 years of your life compiling the material and then writing this story? And I always say that it was serendipitous. As a family historian, if you find something that you weren't looking for in a particular place, you call it serendipity. And I think this is a great example of something that was serendipity. My mom, back in about 2006, 2007, said to me, why don't you figure out who your grandpa's cousin was that died in the trolley accident in Pittsburgh? And I said, well, do you have a little more information for me so that I could do the research by focusing on something? She said, no, I don't remember many of the details. They didn't really talk about it. So being the dutiful daughter, I went to Carnegie Library and looked at some newspapers from the early 1900s and found that trolley accidents involving people, other vehicles, animals were daily occurrences. The likelihood of me being able to figure this mystery out was about zero. Along came 2011, December 24th, in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, there's an almanac every day. And on that day in 2011, there was a tiny indication 20 people were killed in 1917 in a Mount Washington streetcar accident, and it was declared one of the worst transportation accidents in the history of Pittsburgh. She handed me that and said, go check it out, see whether there's anything there that might tell us if it's grandpa's cousin that was involved in that accident. 26th of December, I went to Carnegie Library, started reading about the accident, spent several hours trying to grasp how horrific it was, and then said, well, how will I know if somebody's related to our family was involved in this accident? I was able to, the newspaper, there were 6 regional newspapers in the city, and each one of them had lists of those who were involved in the accident. And in regard to Pittsburgh's the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, the predecessor was the Pittsburgh Dispatch, and they had a listing of the victims of the accident. And I picked up the first name, went to the obituaries, and it was my grandpa's cousin. So at that point, I said, this is a compelling story. It deserves greater attention, because if I was able to find it after all these years, then maybe other people would benefit by what I was able to do to put the pieces together. I found that the trolley accident really served as a tipping point between Pittsburgh Railways, the people of the Western Pennsylvania area, and the employers who really found that transportation was not adequate to serve their needs. Pittsburgh Railways had decided to expand probably 20 miles in all directions from the center of the city of Pittsburgh. The population had grown in the city. People needed the transportation to get to work, and the employers wanted the people to be on time. In 1917, none of those things worked. And as a consequence, there was a lot of frustration and tension, and this accident became a tipping point. I was able to rely on local newspapers. As I said, there were about 6 different ones that followed this story from the time it happened in 1917 through 1935. The stories created a timeline for me to follow in terms of gathering the details about the story. I was also very fortunate to have a really good newspaper microfilm library at Carnegie Library. I spent hours and hours and hours reading microfilm and making copies and whatnot. And then I went to other repositories and archives in the city, in Pennsylvania, in other places to gather material to fill in the gaps. And as I said, one of the things that I wanted to do was to allow other people to appreciate this story that hadn't been told since it happened in the early 1900s. I divided my book into 3 pieces: the accident, what I call the backstory, which talks about the tunnel, and then the streetcar, the trolley, and then the aftermath after the accident, going from the coroner's inquest to criminal prosecution, civil claims, and then ultimately Pittsburgh Railways bankruptcy in 1918. One of the other motivations that I had to do this came with an experience I had had about a dozen or so years ago. One of my friends knew I did family history research, and that it was along the Scots-Irish lines. So he said to me one day, "Read this book. You might like to read this book and learn about what Jim Webb had to say about the Scots-Irish in early colonial America." So, like all good family history researchers, instead of starting on page 1 of the book, I looked at the index to see if there were any names there that related to my family. Thomas Lackey, my 6th great grandfather, was indeed listed in the index. And I went to the page, and there's Jim Webb talking about standing in the cemetery where his 5th great grandfather, my 6th great grandfather, and grandmother had been buried. I'd been looking for that spot for a very long time. And even though his was a bigger story about the Scots-Irish, the chapter or so that he talked about his connection to the Scots-Irish in my family became a real interesting part of my research. And I thought other people would respond perhaps to what I had found in a similar sort of fashion. So that's why I decided this should be a book. My first opportunity to tell the story came in December of 2017, 100 years after the trolley accident. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette used to have the next page, which was the last page of the editorial section, where a local writer could present a story that they had either researched or experienced. And so I was given the opportunity to do, in a very small 1,500 word essay, an outline of what had happened. I decided that I wanted to learn about Pittsburgh in 1917. So I consulted, we have something is called Pittsburgh, Historic Pittsburgh rather, where you can find all kinds of things that the libraries in this area have put on the internet so that you can have free access to it. So that was one of the places that I began. This is the area of the Smithfield Street Bridge. This is going into the city. And at that time, all along the riverfront is what would be considered the commercial area. So people coming into the city to shop ended up in this area. Riverboats were important, as well as all the traffic, whether it be wagon, horses, buggies, streetcars, and other motorized vehicles that use that bridge. This is the view towards Mount Washington. This is where the tunnel is right now. This was called Coal Hill prior to being Mount Washington, because this was a huge mining area. People in the day before this the tunnel was built used the inclines, and over in this area were zigzag steps to go up and down the hill if you cared to walk. Otherwise, it would take about 45 minutes to use a trolley as transportation that circumnavigated that hillside. So there was a very big pent-up demand for some other way to get into the city. What had happened over time is that people lived in the low-lying areas along the rivers for a long time, until heavy industry came and took over that land in the Pittsburgh area. So as the industry took over the land closest to the river banks, people had to move up the hillsides, over the hillsides, outward. So it became less likely that you could walk to work. More likely you had to have a trolley nearby that you could use as a means of transportation. This is a picture of the Smithfield Street Bridge that linked Mount Washington, South Side, and places beyond to the downtown area of Pittsburgh. This is what Pittsburgh looked like on a busy day. There were at this time about 588,000 people who actually lived in the city of Pittsburgh. There were about 1.5 million people who lived in Allegheny County. There were 250,000 households. And in 1916, there were 270,000 people who came in to the city to work on a daily basis using trolley transportation. So it was a very busy time, very busy place. And one of the things that drew, when you think about the time, 1917, the United States had just entered World War I. From 1914, though, Pittsburgh became a munitions area to supply the war. You had 500,000 people working in what we would call heavy industry, and much of that was to produce munitions. The other industries that we had in the Pittsburgh area were related to glass and steel and iron. So there was a great deal of activity. You would say that Pittsburgh and the surrounding area was relatively prosperous. One of the problems that we ran into was that as the demand for heavy industry increased, people moved from service, what we would call service jobs today, and public transportation was a type of service job, into the higher paying positions. So you ended up in many cases with women taking on jobs that men had previously performed. And then you had lesser or lower skilled people taking up the service type occupations. Pittsburgh Railways found that it had a tough time filling the jobs. Conductor, motorman, and maintenance and other types of jobs that were related to the trolley service. And at the end of 1917, one of the things that they complained about a lot was they just did not have enough people to run the trolleys and maintain the trolleys. And that was one of the factors that contributed to the bigger frustration of not having enough trolley transportation at the proper times on a daily basis. Pittsburgh Railways was part of a bigger entity called the Philadelphia Company. Didn't have anything to do with Philadelphia. It was just an available name that was adopted by the folks in the Pittsburgh area who wanted to have a conglomeration of interests. Philadelphia Company was not only Pittsburgh Railways, it was Equitable Gas, Duquesne Light, something called Allegheny Steam Heating, Allegheny Valley Railroad, and a number of other interests that were in some ways transportation, sometime in terms of utilities. If you have electric, gas, and other forms of heating all under one umbrella, they were a fairly powerful group of people in this area. The ownership consisted of surnames of Mellon, Frick, Westinghouse, and others. At the time of the accident in Pittsburgh or Western Pennsylvania, you had 2 drafts. By the end of the war, 60,000 young men from the county had gone to the military. This first draft was in April of 1917. The second came in mid-December, right before Christmas. So one of the things that was part of the fabric of Christmas in 1917 was that there were hundreds of soldiers home for their last visit before they were going off to war. The activity on Christmas Eve in the afternoon was lots of busyness, people going shopping. It even talks about how people were still going to the post office, if you could believe it, to mail packages with the idea that they were going to get there for Christmas. So it was a busy afternoon, people doing a lot of different things all at the same time. One of the things that I found to be somewhat interesting was that the Red Cross was a critical organization in this area. It said there were 250,000 families in Allegheny County, and almost all of them were members of the Red Cross. On Christmas Eve, the idea was that everybody was to put a candle in their window as an observance of the fact that their young men had gone off to war. Children bought saving stamps at school to help with the war effort. One of the things, though, that was also interesting and I was surprised when I found it, was that in December of 1917, the people of Allegheny County withdrew $1 million from their Christmas savings accounts to use as part of their holiday activity. This is the area that was most affected. The trolley was called the Knoxville 4236, but the area that was served was a bit bigger. And I have a map in a few minutes that will show where the people actually lived in the neighborhoods. There were several of these, although this is a map that's current. If we were back in 1917 and looking at a map, a lot of these were independent municipalities that were ultimately folded into Pittsburgh through annexation. But in 1917, there were many separate municipalities with their own elected officials that got involved in dealing with this accident. About 3 p.m. in the afternoon on December 24th, we had a cold and rainy afternoon. At 3:04, the conductor and motorman took control of the trolley at the South Hills Junction of Pittsburgh Railways. The conductor and motorman changed, but they changed into a trolley that had 120 people on it. The trolley had a capacity of 59, so everybody else was standing. 59 seats, the rest were standing. This is what the South Hills Junction looked like at that time. This is what the tunnel entry, the portal on the south end looked like. And this is what it looked like as it on the northern end at the exit. These are railroad tracks, and the exit is right there. This picture is particularly interesting because it looks like it has just rained. And I imagine it looked pretty much like this the day of the accident. This is looking outward from the tunnel exit towards the Smithfield Street Bridge. And over in this picture, this is what Carson Street looked like. Cross the Smithfield Street Bridge was Smithfield Street with the intersection of Carson Street. You might want to keep this in mind as we go along. This is a diagram that was done right after the accident to remind people of where things were. And this is the accident scene. The motorman and conductor, as I said, got on the trolley about 3:04. It was a crowded time, so there were trolleys backed up. As they went into the tunnel, there is an area of up to 200 feet that's relatively flat. And when they got into that area, the trolley came off the wire. Because there were so many people on the trolley, the conductor couldn't move to go out and put the trolley back on. The motorman didn't want to, he was aggravated. And so they had some words, according to the folks who were on the trolley. The car behind them was from Charleroi, and that motorman finally said, all right, I'll get out and fix this. And he did, and got back onto his trolley, gave the signal for them to go ahead. At that time, the motorman turned the controller on full speed. And the estimated speed the trolley was moving was up to 60 miles an hour. The tunnel has a grade of almost 6%. And the tunnel is 3,292 feet long. The stated safe speed was less than 10 miles per hour. The passengers talked about seeing the lights inside the tunnel flashing by. They were probably in shock to the point where they reported there was no screaming, no reaction. It was just like impending doom had fallen upon them. The motorman, after he realized what was going on, and he was in the tunnel, 6% grade, couldn't get the trolley stopped. He used all his braking systems, and nothing really stopped or slowed down that trolley to its 10 mile per hour or less speed. The estimate is that he exited the tunnel at 35 miles an hour. At the exit of the tunnel is a little bit elevated above Carson Street, and there is also a curve in the track. When the trolley got to the curve, because of the speed that it was traveling, it tipped to the left. There were poles, utility poles over here. The back of the trolley's roof was sheared off by these poles. And you can't see in these pictures, but the trucks ended up in various places when the trolley jumped off the track. This picture was taken shortly after the accident, and I'm always just astounded at how many people congregated so quickly. 18 people were crushed to death. 5 died later in local hospitals. The ages ranged from 10 to 57. There were 80 people who were also injured. A few of those people were on the ground waiting for a trolley and did not get out of the way soon enough. There was a young man over here selling roasted peanuts that when he sensed what was happening, he jumped out of the way.
Mary Jane, I'm sorry to interrupt. We cannot see your pointer. So if you could describe where he was standing just based on what's in the picture. I'm sorry.
or on the left side, it says Smithfield Confectionery, excuse me, where the poles are tilted or lying on the ground is where the young man was. There are people in the office building in the upper right, left-hand corner of the picture that heard the crash. They said it sounded like a bomb had gone off, and a huge cloud of black smoke rose in that area. They instantaneously came out of that building to see what was going on and to see what they could do to help. So the folks that worked at the P&LE Railroad were really the first responders for the day. There were, because of the nature of the activity of the day, there were also some extra police in that intersection, and they called for all the police who were available to come and render assistance. You can see the vehicles in that area. A lot of them were private vehicles that the police commandeered to take people to the morgue, to the hospital, in some cases probably home. Anybody who could transport people were put into service on that day. This is one of the newspaper front pages from December 25th. Almost everybody published immediately to let people know what had happened. Today, this is what the tunnel looks like. And if you can see in the distance, that white spot, that's the south portal. The curve in the track is still there. The floor of the tunnel has underwent renovation in 1975. Up until that time, it was just two sets of tracks, much like I would say to the audience, railroad tracks, so that they would understand what they look like. But because we use this is used for buses today, they had to put concrete on the floor and then embed the tracks into the concrete. This is my map of where the victims lived. If we'd expand this, you'd see that there were neighbor upon neighbor upon neighbor in Beltzhoover, Allentown, Bon Air, Knoxville, Mount Oliver. Almost everybody knew somebody when this happened. And the headline was that the whole city grieved. This was a cloud over the city for the holiday in 1917. What I was able to do from reading newspapers and looking for details and names and addresses and whatnot was to compile a list of over 100 people who were directly related to the accident. Some were the responders, some were the folks who were in that intersection, but they've all have a connection. And I was able to use census data and other public websites to put together little descriptions of the individuals who were involved. I was able to capture pictures. They're not the best pictures in the world, but they certainly show who these folks were. Wesley Jones had been rejected from service because he was a tall, skinny kid. But in mid-December, the decision the federal government made was that he could be drafted. He was excited to go and become part of the war effort. He did not survive the crash. There were sisters, there were families, there were husbands and wives. There were notables as well. In the upper left-hand corner is a woman who's, she and her husband owned one of the downtown cafes. And most often, if you looked at the newspapers at the time, all of their personal lives were reported on in the newspapers. So it was kind of an odd thing, but it was part of the fabric of the community. The reason she got, and another reason for why she got so much attention is that ultimately when damages were awarded. She had lost her fur coat in the wreck, and the fur coat was deemed much more valuable than a whole lot of people who died. This is an example of one of the sketches that I was able to put together. Josephine Rietzbach was a housekeeper, and she lived in Bloomfield with her employer, and she'd gone to the cemetery to put a wreath on her husband's grave. They first identified her through her possessions in her purse, but later her employer, Mrs. Chaplin, thought, yeah, there's something wrong here, went to the morgue, and that's where she found her. I believe that she was one of the oldest folks to be affected by the disaster. This is a picture of the Allegheny County morgue. I included it because one of the things that happened is when the accident was reported, people congregated not only at West Carson and Smithfield Street, but they also collected at the county morgue. At that time, it was a very public place. You could go in and take a look around it at any time. And ultimately, when I talk about the family connection, that comes into play. I was able to access all sorts of records on the internet. I was also able to make site visits to Carnegie Library, the Allegheny County Courts, Civil and Criminal Records Division, the Heinz History Center, Library and Archives, the University of Pittsburgh Archives, and then the National Archives over in Philadelphia. One of the things that was very beneficial to me was that I never asked a question that I didn't get an answer to. People were very, very cooperative. And I think that in the end, that cooperative spirit, that interest in the story helped move me along in terms of the research. The sources from my broader context, US Census data, US Department of Labor information, all became part of that discussion of Pittsburgh in 1917. I like maps. I was able to use the Hopkins maps to locate people in the neighborhoods. When I did the map showing where each individual lived, I was able to go from the Hopkins maps to Google Maps today to create that. This is an example of historic Pittsburgh, which you can access through the website. I like this map because the tunnel is underneath Mount Washington, and in 1904, this was 1904, the tunnel was built, and just right after that, 1906, this map was done, and it shows the South Hills Junction and the path of the tunnel all the way to its exit on Smithfield and West Carson Street. When the tunnel was built, people complained that it was so noisy because they worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to build it. And I can hardly imagine if you lived on any of the streets above it, what it must have been like. My grandpa's cousin was part of a chain migration. Her cousin came to Western Pennsylvania in about 1907. She and her husband, and then she and her daughters came to Western Pennsylvania in 1909. My grandpa came in 1910, and my grandma came in 1914, and others came at various times between that 1907 and probably about 1920. They were certainly evidence of chain migration and clustering. They all stayed relatively close by in Western Pennsylvania. They were all tradespeople, from blacksmith to glassblower, glass molder. They were here because there were jobs, and they had learned trades in Austria, Hungary, and brought those trades here to practice. They said this is one of the clippings from the newspaper with the first item, Mrs. Leo Zerny. Her name was Aurelia, 45 years old, 438 Althea Street, died in St. Joseph's Hospital, and her body was identified by her son at the morgue. Could find her death certificate, and most of all, I was able to find short feature pieces in regard to this family. The one that says Christmas tree standing. When I read that, I didn't even have to look at the names of who was involved, because the process of hiding the Christmas tree until it was time to show the kids the train, the tree, the gifts, was all what I had experienced as a child. Unfortunately, the other clipping on the right-hand side, the boy identifies mother. As I said before, at the morgue, people tended to gather. Aurelia Zerny had 7 children, aged 3 to 21. Her 21-year-old gathered with the crowd, not knowing that his mother and father were on the trolley when it crashed. He was at the morgue with his friends, and because of the nature of the situation at the time, he recognized his mother. And that's how he realized she had died. The story goes on to say that the morgue employees, when they realized that he had found his mother, tried to keep the crowds away from him because he was so overcome. So it was interesting to read about the people who were involved and how they took care of one another. I was able to find passenger records to verify when they came here. This was for Aurelia's earning. She was 34 when she came, and her daughters were 10, 12, and 34. We found that the 10-year-old Irene is somebody that I knew when I was growing up, and they never spoke about the accident. They became naturalized citizens as quickly as possible. And again, back to the maps, they're listed on the map in the city of Pittsburgh, in Beltzhoover, which is part of the city of Pittsburgh. This is what their house looked like. And just recently the siding changed, but I would imagine that's a pretty good picture of what that house looked like. They were in city directories. They were in 1920, 3 years after the accident. The family had scattered. Most went to Detroit, again, for work. The father was unable to work for a while. He lived near where his children were, but his children were cared for by the oldest son. And this census record indicates that they were the children of the oldest son. It would be interesting to know whether that was a mistake or whether that was something they had decided, that if you were 3 and 5 years old, that you could do that and they wouldn't remember the mother. The aftermath consisted of criminal, civil, and bankruptcy records. The coroner, immediately after the accident, took charge. He called the Pittsburgh, he was the Allegheny County coroner, even though the Pittsburgh police, fire, and elected officials were on the scene. He really said, this is something that I have to deal with as the coroner. And he kind of distanced himself from the political world that existed at that time. The Public Services Commission was the state organization that was responsible for investigating accidents. On the evening of December 24th, their chief investigator was already on the scene of the accident. He went to the car barn where the wreckage had been carried off and immediately inspected to see whether there were any mechanical issues. He found none, that the braking systems were intact. And almost immediately he said that it was not, the car was not the problem, that he thought that it was the operator. The coroner had to delay his investigation and inquest for a couple months because people were in the hospital and could not be called to testify. So in February, he had an inquest, and for every person who was a fatality as a consequence of this accident, you have files that are held by the University of Pittsburgh's archives. And each one of them there's an individual file for each person, and it talks about cause of death. There is a press release that talks about the individual. And then when the coroner's inquest was held, the outcome of the inquest is recorded in regard to the case. All those documents are available for review. When the coroner's jury made its decision, it talked in terms of responsibility. It suggested, recommended, advised that the motorman and the dispatcher be held responsible and that they should be taken to trial. During the course of the inquest, there was information, although there was no proof, that the motorman was intoxicated. And there were varying stories from people who had seen him for the 2 days before in various bars and saloons and whatnot. But there was no absolute proof that could be attached to his whereabouts or his activities. They also concentrated in their recommendation on the safety aspects of the situation. They talked about doing something so that curve in the track at the end of the north end of the tunnel wouldn't pose as big a risk. I don't know that anything ever happened as a consequence of that, but they identified that curve is what really knocked the car off the track. And that maybe, even though it was going faster than it was supposed to, maybe that could have been mitigated if there was something on the track that would have kept it from falling over. They also talked about if you have a capacity of 59, a stated capacity of 59, that 120 people is not okay. That Pittsburgh Railways really had to address overcrowding, that this was not the first trolley that was overcrowded, that this was normal, and the situation was intolerable. They also talked about training people, that there were some safety concerns, and they weren't being addressed, and they should train their employees to have safer operations. In the end, the coroner's inquest recommendations were taken to criminal court. The Allegheny County District Attorney decided that even though there were 23 recommendations in terms of holding people responsible, that he would try only essentially three of the 23 cases at once. He said he would handle the rest of them at another time. There were the three victims that he chose were a mother and daughter, Ella Sheridan and her daughter Gladys, and Clara Tanney. Trial was held. The difficulty at trial was that the daughter was treated, and she died maybe 4 weeks after the accident. And by the time the trial was held, the doctor who had treated her at the hospital was on military duty in Europe. The court said that because he was not present, that nobody else could provide information about the case. And so that particular count in terms of the trial was dropped. So you ended up with 2 convictions, Clara Tanny and Ella Sheridan. The motorman was held liable, and he was given a term of 18 to 24 months at Western Penitentiary. And when it came time for the district attorney to pick up the other 20 cases and try those, there had been a mistake made. On this document, if you look at the upper right-hand corner, all those numbers represent cases. And the judge at a later point said Herman Klingler, who had been tried, had been convicted because all of those cases were listed on the document. He could not be tried for the other 20 deaths. That it would be deemed double jeopardy. So that was the end of the criminal proceedings. I was able to find records from Western Penitentiary where the motorman was taken in. That was his official record. That's what he looked like. That's the only picture I was able to find of him. The next step was civil claims. One of the things that happened when there was an accident, Pittsburgh Railways didn't offer any kind of compensation or assistance. You had to sue them. If you go to the Allegheny County Civil Courts Division and look at the records, hundreds and hundreds of times in the early 1900s, Pittsburgh Railways was sued by passengers to try to recover, whether it was medical expenses, lost wages, lost possession, whatever it was. They had to sue in order to get any kind of compensation. The 120 people who were affected by this accident resulted in 68 suits being filed against Pittsburgh Railways. And at that time, because people moved from the area and the cases were dropped because they didn't respond, we ended up with 54 verdicts, and the value of the awards ranged from $225 to $22,000. In April of 1918, Pittsburgh Railways cited that these cases were sufficient to push it into bankruptcy. That this list that I found at the National Archives in Philadelphia lists those 54 verdicts or cases that could result in verdicts, and they had assumed that it would cost about $750,000 to settle these claims. They went into bankruptcy in April 1918. They remained in bankruptcy until 1925. The people who had been awarded judgments waited until 1925 through 1935 to receive compensation. The court in 1925 said they could take 10 years to pay. So you have this accident in 1917 and final payments occurring in 1935. In some cases, banks in the area or other financial institutions agreed to exchange money for the potential claim, so that it was, they went and collected from Pittsburgh Railways after the people had assigned their claims to them. Let's see. One of the things that I was fortunate enough to find were records related to the Knoxville 4236. The St. Louis Car Company, the archival materials are at the Washington University in St. Louis. And I was really fortunate that your own archives at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum had drawings of the construction drawings for the trolleys. And Ed Lieberger, one of your former archivists, was very helpful in sending me the material. I was really shocked and surprised, and that's what he sent me. One of the things that was talked about well after the accident as a general concern was the roof line of this trolley. This was called the Pittsburgh car. It was low to the ground so people could get on quickly and off quickly. And the roof was raised so that those little rectangular items at the top of the roof were there for ventilation. What it ended up doing is made the car very unstable. So when we talked about the car tipping over, hitting the poles, the roof was ripped off by those poles because of based on the construction. There are some other pictures too that, well, it's a better rendering. That in the construction process, you can see how what it looked like, and even more so when you look at the frame. Interior of the car, the conductor couldn't get to the emergency brake that was at the middle of the car because there were too many people. The tunnel, the south portal, and this is the drawing. The Port Authority of Allegheny County, now the Pittsburgh Regional Transit Authority, was kind enough to provide me with this drawing. It was of the 1904 construction process, and it was used in the planning for the 1975 rehab that put the concrete floor in so that buses could go through this tunnel as well. My rendition of what the grade looked like in the tunnel. This is what the north portal looks like today. This is what the view towards the bridge. Not much has changed in terms of the configuration, nor the size of the intersection. I mentioned reader response was really good. And in many cases, people provided me with information that I had no other way to get. The McCoy children were interesting. Anna McCoy's grandchildren, David, Joy, and Bill, contacted me after the article appeared in the Post-Gazette in 2017. Elmer and Matt were on the trolley. They had gone to visit an uncle, and the uncle had given them an air rifle as a Christmas gift. They were thrilled to pieces and told everybody on the trolley about it. So whenever the accident occurred, everybody could remember how excited these kids were for their gift. Elmer was on the left-hand side. He died at the end of January. He never really regained consciousness. Matt, who's in the middle, had some injuries, but he was able to go home on the 24th of December. The little girl on the right-hand side is Anna. She didn't go with them that day because she needed a new coat, and Mom and Dad took her to shop for a new coat while the boys went to visit the uncle. Angela and Robert Rosenfelder were on the trolley. Angela's granddaughter, Jill, again, contacted me after reading the article and told me about her grandmother. Robert Rosenfelder died in the accident. Angela was injured. She had a head injury. She had a steel plate in her head as a consequence of the accident. And Jill said that her grandmother reminded them often that she was able to forge ahead and do anything she needed to do. And she would tap on the metal plate in her head as a way to encourage them to try harder. Angela went on to have 7 children. The Rosenbergers, Christina, Henry, and Elfrida were all on the trolley. Elfrida was going to work. She was a supervisor at Bell Telephone in downtown. Henry and his mom, Christina, were going down to shop. And one of the things about this family was that all of them sued Pittsburgh Railways, and the cases were of such interest that they were written up in the legal journals in Western Pennsylvania. And I found where most of the other cases were just decisions, I found detail about the testimony in regard to these cases. Elfrida was 18 years old when her case went to trial. Pittsburgh Railways was not interested in being compassionate or sympathetic. And one of the things that came out during trial, what Elfrida had suffered arm and facial injuries of tremendous difficulty. Took months for her to heal, and almost daily doctor's visits in the first few weeks. The attorney for Pittsburgh Railways in the courtroom held up 2 pictures of her before and after the accident, and he said, "There's not a whole lot of difference between what you look like before and what you look like after the accident." Collectively, this family had one of the biggest jury awards of all the cases. And ultimately, Elfrida, who was, I think she had 7 or 9 children, she moved to Florida with them and lived there for the rest of their lives. When I was at a conference talking about this story, a man came up to me afterward and he said he wanted me to know that the Rosenbergers were his cousins, and he remembers meeting Henry when he was just 17 or 18 years old. I would think that Henry probably was 35 or 40 at that time. Henry was a newspaper reporter in West Virginia. The last person to contact me was this gentleman, David Zerny. And he is Aurelia Zerny's, my grandpa's cousin's grandson. He lives over in Illinois now, and was very pleased that somebody had put all these details together so that they would know more about their family history. Where can you find the book? The Trolley Museum has the book. And if you don't wish to buy it, you can get a copy through interlibrary loan. Carnegie Library has a number of copies, and they're quite pleased to share them. Anybody have any questions?
Wow, thank you very much, Dr. Hirt. We'll get to questions in just a minute. If anyone has any questions, you can throw those into the chat box, or in just a minute, I will let everybody unmute themselves. But really quickly, before we do that, I do want to mention we've got some other Trolleyology programs coming up. Next month, we'll have Railroads, Art, and American Life presented by J. Craig Thorpe, and Where the Heck is Hecla by Dennis Kramer. And I want to thank everybody again for coming tonight, especially those of you who made a donation during your registration process. You can always support the museum at patrolley.org/support. And as Dr. Hirt mentioned, we do have a number of copies of the book available at the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum store at this moment. So let me allow everybody to unmute here. Okay, getting lots of nice comments in the chat box here. Appreciation about your use of original resources. Okay, if you have a question or a comment, you should be able to unmute yourselves now. And I also invite you to turn on your video if you'd like as well. Thank you again Mary Jane, and we'll see if anybody has any comments.
Yeah, a slight comment. You mentioned about mailing packages on the 24th and expecting them to arrive on the 25th. You said, well, I believe Christmas wasn't a federal holiday at that time. So it would have been okay to mail something on the 24th, expect it to arrive on the 25th. And mail service was so good in those days, unlike today, that you can expect delivery. Didn't Pittsburgh have trolleys that were mail cars for moving mail around the city? So you could expect mail to get within the Pittsburgh area at least the next day.
The Pittsburgh Railways have US mail cars. I
Yeah.
think,
At what time?
okay.
Sometimes I feel like I lived back in 1917, but I didn't. I don't know the answer to the question about the mail cars, but I do recall as a child, we had so much mail during the holidays that they would come twice a day. So I would assume that somebody could go in the middle of the afternoon and assume that they could get their package to somebody across town or whatever without any difficulty, because we did have better service at that time. But it was just part of the activity of the afternoon. Today, I don't think we would be running off to the grocery store at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but because of the nature of how people lived, Aurelia and Leo Zerny were going to get groceries and last minute Christmas gifts when they were on the trolley. So it was a little bit different than what we have today.
Great. Edward, I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I'd like to comment. I thought, being familiar with some construction details, I doubt that the vestibule, that the ventilation system contributed to the higher center of gravity on the car. I think your big problem was the fact that that car was probably designed with 59 seats, probably a working max of 100 with standees, but it was loaded to almost twice its weight limit. And just, anything coming at, and I know the Smithfield Street, the curve at the end of the tunnel, anything coming at higher than the speed, that particular overloading, that just, it was a classic example of an overloaded car tipping over on its side.
And one of the things that you have to add to it is because it was a Christmas holidays, they were carrying packages and so it was more than packed with people. It was just overwhelmed with stuff, people and their stuff. And going back to the car, I did some research and did find engineers who studied the situation and said that the top of the car was definitely a structural concern, and that I mean, I'm not an engineer, but I could, they talked about how the Pittsburgh car is the only one that was built like that. Well,
they were a unique P.N. Jones design.
Yes.
And
yes.
But Clever Story cars ran all over the country for years, all over the world for years. In fact, you go to Portugal, you can still see some running in Lisbon. It basically is just a framework, and it's more the center. And now the other thing that concerns me, and this is from doing investigations, civil investigations, federal government, was that the examiner didn't look at the wreck until after it was moved to the car barn. And yeah, I know the Pittsburgh Railways wanted to get their system running again, but very cleverly, you could substitute trucks for a recently shot pair of trucks for what might have been the trucks underneath. So we do have the motorman's testimony. Of course, he had self-interest of stating that the brakes weren't working.
Well, one of the things that we also have is somebody who was standing behind him was a railroad engineer, and he gave testimony about the actions of the motorman. And through all the civil and criminal proceedings, that testimony tended to carry a great deal of weight. And so, you know, one of the things that Pittsburgh Railways did was the accident, I think it was 3:18 in the afternoon when it occurred, something like 5 o'clock in the afternoon, 5:30 in the afternoon, the wreckage was cleared, as you say, because they wanted to get back on schedule.
It was you know, that was a choke point for Pittsburgh Railways.
Right,
Yep.
right. Well, it's probably still is when you. So we, based on what we have from the Public Services Commission, based on the existing records, that's what we have to go with. And it would be awful if it were a situation where somebody wasn't being honest in how the investigation was performed.
Here's
oh.
your statement about double jeopardy.
The motorman,
A couple years
Wait.
ago, we had a gentleman convicted in state court of murder. He served 4 years or so. The governor pardoned him. He walked out of the jail. The feds arrested him, retried him for murder, and reconvicted him. And everybody's going, wait a minute, you can't do that twice for a murder. And they said, yes, you can. You can convict in state court and convict in federal court for the same crime.
Well, in this case, it was the state, the Court of Common Pleas that determined that and it was a clerical error. It wasn't something that people.
An accidental or on purpose clerical error.
It's always in the paperwork when it comes to the legal arena.
So we did have a question in the chat. Mary Jane, do you happen to know when the next trolley car would have come to maybe relieve some of that crowd, or the suggestion of 4, 8, maybe 12, 16 minutes?
I have no idea, but one of the things that I can tell you is that that the cars were lined up from various locations behind this one, and that's why when the trolley went off, there was so much frustration. The other thing is, and I was able to read about people and their reactions. And one of the things that happened a short time later was that people who were in Knoxville and Beltzhoover actually took over the tunnel one day because the trolleys didn't come. The Pittsburgh Railways was using they wanted to expand outward, and they didn't have the resources appropriate to do that expansion and take care of the passengers that needed service. So these folks, I think they talked about it being snowing and, you know, middle of winter, and they just became so disturbed by the fact that they waited and waited and waited, and they were going to be late to work and so forth, that they picked up and walked through the tunnel and stopped everybody. There were other instances in other parts of the city where people were angry because they couldn't get to where they were wanting to go, and they would essentially beat up the motorman. And you'd have stories about the conductor fleeing the trolley because the passengers were so upset. Things being thrown at the trolley cars. There was a great level of frustration over the fact that there weren't enough cars at the right times to provide the transportation. So
yeah.
George, were you going to say something?
Well, I was going to say a few things because, you know, I'm sure as anything coming into the junction is probably being detoured, even as far as 18th Street and over the 10th Street Bridge. They would find ways to move everything that wasn't stranded in the tunnel. They may have even started to back cars out of the tunnel. I have a copy of a postcard, and why I think the motorman should have known better in any case. And probably the postcards from about 1910. I'm sure this didn't change. But the sign over the tunnel, the south portal, said to consume 4 minutes.
Yes.
Tunnel. You needed to take
Yes.
minutes.
Yes,
And I'm sure
yes.
sometimes the route foreman checked them. So
One of the,
where
one
was
of the
the
cons-
operator's mind that he was going to catch up on Christmas Eve, catch up his schedule? I doubt it.
we don't know what was in his mind, but they said that he had only worked for 6 months.
Mm.
And that's why the coroner's jury was so adamant about saying safety training, because there were obvious absences of good judgment and other things that may have prevented the accident.
The only thing is, some of you guys probably know this, but I work for the Transit Authority, and I'll tell you what, even on a line that have 5 to 10 minute service, there's never enough for people. They want to walk out there and see it right there. And that's probably why when the automobile showed up, I want to buy one.
Well, the one thing that I read about was that a normal trolley trip before the tunnel opened was about 45 minutes, and it was cut back to 10 or 15. So when you think about the before and after, and when the tunnel opened, there was a great celebration because the people were so excited they were going to gain all that time in their travel.
Well,
A
it just
comment
took
in
4
the
minutes
chat.
to go through. Anybody ever consider the fact that a load on that trolley, I mean, in addition to whatever he did, the operator did, that was double the load, and that was a lot more weight going down that 6% grade.
One of the things that I tried to demonstrate was the force with which the trolley hit the ground. And we kind of figured it would be comparable to like 9 to 12 sticks of dynamite, which.
And that was one of the questions in the chat was, given where the wreckage ended up, do you know if it came close to hitting any other cars, like an outbound car that would have been on Smithfield Street? Given the
No,
questions?
it didn't hit another car, but it did hit a woman and killed her.
Right.
It crushed her.
And returning to the motorman, Elizabeth, one of my coworkers, says, not that it would excuse his behavior, but if the operator was grumpy or possibly going through something at the time. You mentioned his potential drinking. She's curious what the real story was at the time, what the motorman's life was like.
My sense is it probably wasn't very, when you think about Pittsburgh at the time, there were many people who were what we would call prosperous because of the war-related production. And if you think about, I mean, women in the day, they were bringing women in to do maintenance. By the end of the war, women were conductors on the trolleys. As soon as the war was over, they pushed the women out of the system. The men that came in to operate the trolleys were probably low skilled and ill trained, and they were trying to do something with people that probably should not have been operating the trolleys. After the motorman came out of prison, I don't know that he had an occupation. All I could find was he worked for his brother who had a butcher shop, and lived with his mother.
Can I ask, you how long the motorman spent time in prison? What his sentence was?
I think it was about 20 months, maximum 2 years, but no longer.
I know this is not the area of research of the book, but I'm sure you came across it. There was a question in the chat about other accidents in the tunnel. So I know there were more either in the tunnel or just outside the tunnel. Did you have to weed through a lot of those to find what you were looking for?
No, once the item appeared in the newspaper, I didn't have to look for anything else.
Okay.
I could concentrate on this. But the accidents, if you have nothing to do someday, go to the library and read microfilm, because the articles about the accidents, or go to the courthouse and read all the cases. People were victims, and it was more than you could imagine. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people.
Yeah. And another question about the motorman. Do you know if he had fought in the war prior to becoming an operator?
No,
No, he couldn't have because we didn't enter the
Yeah.
war until
until
1918, I believe.
Oh,
19,
We were not part
1917.
of the war.
The spring of 1917. No, he was not a service member.
okay.
He was described as a cowpuncher in Texas.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions? Bill T, I see your hand raised.
Yes, what kind of safety mechanisms or equipment were added after the accident to try to prevent it from happening again?
I have no idea because there was never a report of it. There were no specific elements to the recommendation. The coroner's jury said you need to review the operations of the trolley and decide what has to be done to keep people safer. I mean, it was generic, but it was an attempt to draw attention to the fact the overcrowding was probably the biggest factor. That you couldn't put 120 people in a car that was outfitted for 59 and expect it to be okay if there was an incident. Like I said, I don't believe that anything was done to the track other than to embed it into the concrete. And
Yeah.
probably the biggest change was the speed, that there was an emphasis placed on you cannot go more than, was it 9 miles an hour through that tunnel?
But that was already in place. That was.
Well, but
Pittsburgh
nobody was
regulation,
enforcing. Nobody
Oh.
enforced it.
You know, and the yellow cars were all built with handbrakes up in the front for a motorman to try to turn. So
It was
we don't know whether he even tried to turn the handbrake. Realizing
There were
that there was
three.
gone.
The engineer that testified verified that the motorman tried. There were 3 braking systems that were available to him, and he tried to make them all work and did not succeed. The conductor could not reach the emergency brake in the middle of the car.
Aren't cars required to stop before they enter the tunnel?
Yes.
Going
Yeah.
Yes.
inbound?
Yes.
Yeah, but then he dewired in the middle of the tunnel.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, after they went into bankruptcy, I assume the same officers remained in the company. When they came out of bankruptcy, it was the same officers?
Not all, but there were some folks. How do I want to say this? The people who were given responsibility to oversee the operation during bankruptcy were not formally associated with them. However, there were some engineering personnel that were part of this supervisory structure that were kept. It was not a complete elimination of people from Pittsburgh Railways. The other thing that was interesting was that in April of 1918 is when the bankruptcy was declared. In the early part of 1918, when the Philadelphia Company's annual report came out, there was a special message right up front that said, "We are no longer reporting Pittsburgh Railways as part of the Philadelphia Company," because they were able to get essentially divorced from financial responsibility. That they carved that out, and the Philadelphia Company was not responsible. Which I don't know whether that, I don't know how hard the argument would be if it were today. But I thought that was interesting that they really protected the Equitable Gas, Duquesne Light, and all the other entities under the umbrella of the Philadelphia Corporation from anything that had to do with this accident or the company. And when the Pittsburgh Railways accumulated all the individual independent lines, they also had all the debt from those developments. And then they were adding on with their own debt to extend the system. So they never operated in a financial positive condition. They were always having difficulty of some sort. And on the 22nd of December, before the accident, they were wanting a rate increase. So add that to the frustration of the passengers. And in many cases, the people said, we'll pay more, we just need service. And it was just a unfortunate set of circumstances.
Edward, I see you have your hand up again.
Yes, Kristen, I just wanted to thank you for organizing this. And as far as the rate increase on Pittsburgh Railways, it was also a time when the federal government was authorizing all sorts of increases for wages. And the rate increase was probably just to be consistent with federally mandated salary increases to the workers. You got to sort of look at the economic times leading up to our involvement in World War I. It was a spiral that kept going up and up and up. And, I'd just leave it at that.
But not only costs of manpower, but don't forget, all of the materials and supplies that Pittsburgh Railways needed was also going up.
Absolutely,
Read
George.
many electric railroads that are having the same issue and raising rates.
Yeah, George, it was everything. The cost of everything was going up. Look at any industry at the time. It was, and defense plants during World War II and World War I paid the best salaries.
Yeah, what you gotta realize is up through 1914, this country was in stagnation. There was really no inflation, no deflation, costs were even. And then 1914, August 14 comes along, the war starts, and all of a sudden it is just spiraling out of control with products increasing 100% or more. And people don't understand because their whole lifestyle for the past 70 some years has been stable prices. What's going on? Why is everything going out of? And it was the war in World War in Europe driving up the prices in this country because they were buying everything.
And to kind of bring it back to the to the presentation and modern day, my coworker Elizabeth notes that after the packed cars on the T a couple weekends ago for the Taylor Swift concert, no one has learned to not pack a car to the brim. So
Basically, I commuted on the Long Island Railroad for 31 years. And on holiday days, people would come out of the woodwork. The trains would be loaded, where you would have a semi-empty train at 4:30 in the afternoon. Previous to the day, on December 24th, the cars were packed to the gills. And unfortunately, the only way the Pittsburgh Railways could have dealt with this would be to remove the entire city and put down nothing but tracks and, get 10-fold number of cars, an impossible economic situation.
Yeah, well, I've got ads printed by the company in Philadelphia, not the Philadelphia company, in the 19-teens, and the same ads in the 1960s, and then SEPTA, the authority, putting them out, and they all show the first car in a line of cars packed to the gills, and everybody in the first car jammed up to the front door, and empty cars coming behind. And people want to get on the first car of no matter what comes. I remember riding a dump car in the city. I knew an operator, and he let me ride with him on a dump car. Somebody was trying to get on a dump car, work car, with no steps. They were waving at us, and then we looked behind, and they were giving us the finger.
Yeah, that's life as a commuter.
Yeah. So, whatever
All
comes,
right.
they'll get on it.
And on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up for the evening. So thank you very much, Mary Jane, for your presentation. If you didn't catch the whole thing, it will be on YouTube within the next couple weeks. And I do invite everybody to stop by the Pennsylvania Trolley Museum store to purchase said book. So thank you again to our presenter. Thank you for everybody for joining us. And if you have an idea for a future Trolleyology, please reach out to me at kfred@patrolley.org. I hope you can join us in the coming weeks or months on Zoom or in person. Thank you again, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Good
Thank you,
night.
Kristen.
Thank you.
Kristen,
Good
can you
night.
stay on for 1
Kristen,
minute?